Hello, I'm Jeremy, the host of Examining Life. Welcome to episode 7 of the first European Buddhist, The Philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Now, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer is known as two things. First, he is considered the father of pessimistic philosophy. The face matches the description. Second, he was the first ever European Buddhist. Over the course of the series, our goal is to make these two lofty titles make sense. To do so, we're breaking Schopenhauer's philosophy down into parts, episode by episode. Each episode answers a key part of the puzzle in his philosophy, including, but not limited to, why you're anxious and depressed, seriously, why no amount of pleasure is sufficient for fulfillment, why individuality is an illusion, the basis of morality, and perhaps most importantly, the way to face life in the midst of inevitable suffering. I hate to say it, but we're getting close to the end of this series. With that said, we're finally getting to the point that I've been waiting for, which is Schopenhauer's moral theory. Schopenhauer's morality follows pretty intuitively from the rest of his theory, which makes this easier for all of us. Now, a few words on his moral theory before we crack in. Schopenhauer's moral theory is a genuinely unique alternative to the typical moral theories we hear about. I also found it to be quite plausible, and I hope that you do as well. Since it's both unique and compelling, many scholars think the theory should be taught in standard ethics classes as an alternative to deontology, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics. While it's not quite there yet, I hope that this series can be a very small step in promoting Schopenhauer's moral theory. In this episode, expect to learn the answers to questions such as, what is practical mysticism? What really motivates people's actions? Is true selflessness possible? And much, much more. But before we get into all of those juicy questions, if you enjoy videos like this that make philosophy accessible without dumbing it down, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a few seconds of your day to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. It really helps small YouTubers like me who are just starting out. Thank you, and let's get back to the video. Part 1. The relation between metaphysics and morals. Something quite difficult for philosophers is making that almighty leap from metaphysics all the way over to ethics. When you're doing metaphysics, you're trying to describe the basis of reality. When you're doing ethics, however, you're typically trying to tell people how they ought to act. So how do these two subsects of philosophy, metaphysics and ethics, relate? Well, metaphysics is more foundational, as it describes the basis of reality. That is, through metaphysics, we derive the axioms and propositions that lead to ethical conclusions. You may think of the relation of metaphysics and ethics as analogous to the relation between physics and chemistry. Neither physics nor chemistry is more important per se, but physics is more rudimentary. That is, in order to do chemistry, you have to take the conclusions already drawn from physics. If you tried to do chemistry without taking anything from physics, you wouldn't be able to get off the ground. In a similar way, ethics is generally built on top of metaphysics, as you need metaphysical conclusions to get off the ground in moral theorizing. Schopenhauer believes that his metaphysics is privileged in the relation it has to his ethics. He, in fact, finds this relation so intuitive that he asserts, quote, "To be just, noble, and benevolent is nothing but to translate my metaphysics into action," end quote. He's saying that acting morally is merely engaging in what he calls practical wisdom, or practical mysticism. In other words, ethical action is just turning theory into practice, the theoretical wisdom in Schopenhauer's metaphysics into practical behaviors and attitudes. At this point, a brief refresher on Schopenhauer's metaphysics might be useful. If this happens to be your first time tuning into the series, I unfortunately can't explain all of Schopenhauer's metaphysics here, but I will give the two-sentence version, and I'll point you to some prior episodes that will give you everything that you need to know. In episode 3, we understood that underneath the world that we experience, there is a unified, transcendent will. This means that our typical experience of having a discrete self that is legitimately distinct from the world is an illusion. In episodes 4 and 5, we understood that this illusion comes at a severe cost, namely immense suffering. Part 2. Practical wisdom. Schopenhauer said that ethics is merely turning his theories into practice. So you might wonder, well, what would it look like to turn an abstract metaphysical doctrine about unity into action? Very straightforwardly, it means treating others according to the truth that you and they are one. This means, in Schopenhauer's terms, treating others as a, quote, I once more, end quote. In other words, it means treating the pain and suffering of others as though it was one's own pain and suffering, because, well, metaphysically, it is. This would entail for Schopenhauer that we somehow identify with the other. We feel their suffering and are motivated to act to relieve their suffering for that own person's sake. But you might wonder, does such a phenomenon ever occur? Is it even possible? Well, Schopenhauer certainly thinks it does, and he thinks almost everybody has had this experience to some capacity. He thinks it's the everyday phenomenon of compassion. Part 3. Compassion. At this point, it would be beneficial to flesh out exactly what Schopenhauer thinks is going on when somebody acts compassionately. So, let's break this down. In Schopenhauer's view, compassion involves a number of necessary conditions. First, the object of my compassion would have to be a sentient being. I could be compassionate towards a person or an animal, but it wouldn't make sense to be compassionate towards, say, a table, because the table, in virtue of not being conscious, cannot experience suffering. Now, it's a very interesting addition by Schopenhauer to include animals in compassion. It was extraordinarily rare in his time and place to attribute higher mental and motivational states like compassion to animals. The typical view at the time was that animals were more like machines who couldn't suffer. Their screams of pain were thought to resemble a train whistle more than a cry. Seems weird, but hey, 19th century Europe was a bizarre place. Anyways, Schopenhauer not only thought that we could be compassionate towards animals, but he also thought that some of the more intelligent animals could display compassion with one another and even towards humans. This was and still is a revolutionary view because, as we'll get to, it not only suggests that we're morally responsible to animals, but that animals also have a moral component to their actions. But before we get to the explicit connection between compassion and morality, we need to finish explaining compassion. So, if I'm compassionate, that compassion is directed towards a sentient being, namely a being that is presently suffering or will suffer in the future. This doesn't exclude much because, as we know from episodes 4 and 5, suffering is absolutely ubiquitous. Now, if I'm truly compassionate to another, I don't merely recognize their pain. Rather, I feel sorry for the sufferer, and further, somehow participate in their suffering. What does that mean? Well, for Schopenhauer, we don't merely imagine ourselves in the shoes of the sufferer. Rather, and this is where it ties into his metaphysics, we're able to transcend our own ego and literally feel the sufferer's pain as theirs. For Schopenhauer, we participate immediately in the pain of the sufferer. It is as though we, in some sense, transcend the border of our skin, gain contact with the universal will, which both me and the sufferer are parts, and feel their suffering directly. From this immediate participation in the sufferer's pain, I desire the sufferer's well-being for their own sake. In other words, if I'm compassionate towards, let's say, my mom, I don't desire her happiness because I think that I'll be rewarded for helping. Rather, I recognize her well-being as important, independent of all else, and desire it for its own sake. Lastly, this desire would motivate me to act to prevent or eliminate my mom's suffering. This cognitive or motivational element of compassion is absolutely essential for Schopenhauer. Compassion is not merely some feeling of emotional contagion, rather it's a motive to relieve the suffering of others. Compassion might now seem awfully complicated, but that's just because we split it into all of its component parts to detail what it involves. However, in practice, it's just, everyday compassion. Without consideration, without deliberation, all this just happens. Just like that. It's one unified experience that overtakes the person instantaneously when they encounter suffering, moving them to relieve or prevent the suffering itself, without any further deliberation. Now that we understand compassion as one motive of action, namely being moved to promote others' well-being for their own sake, it would serve us well to understand other motives of action in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Part 4. The 4 motives of action. For Schopenhauer, all actions have an end goal. This end goal is the ultimate aim or motive of an action. For example, we've already discussed how compassion leads us to act with the ultimate aim of another's well-being. But if you take a second to look at the world around you, it won't be long until you realize that we're not all going around acting compassionately all the time. We don't all selflessly strive for the well-being of others. Rather, we're typically moved by other motives that aren't quite so selfless. If you remember Schopenhauer's doctrine on the will, you'll remember that Schopenhauer thinks the will manifests within us as a restless striving for personal preservation, development, and procreation. That is, our actions are determined by a restlessly striving will that manifests through our bodies. As it happens, we can either act in a way that is favorable to the will, that is, we can try and fulfill the will's desires, Or we can negate the will. That is, we can also refuse to restlessly pursue our desires. In addition, we can promote or negate the will as it appears within ourselves, but we can also be moved to promote or negate the will as it appears in others. Schopenhauer calls acting in the will's interests acting according to weal, and he calls acting against the will's interests acting according to woe. I'm going to use the terms weal and woe because that's how Schopenhauer puts it, but if it's helpful, feel free to replace the term weal with happiness and the term woe with suffering. If we put this all together, it leaves 4 possible motives of action. We can be motivated to bring about the weal of ourselves or others, and we can be motivated to bring about the woe of ourselves or others. It may be helpful to draw this out on a chart. That will make it slightly easier to picture. Then we can go on to explain each of the 4 motives in turn. Now, there's no script for this segment, so if it gets a little bit chaotic, please bear with me, but I think it'll be fun. Hello. Sorry for the change of angle, change of lighting. Hopefully I can see the lights in my eyes a little bit. But we're back, and I have this gorgeous chart, the 4 motives of action, as you can see. Very neat handwriting. I hope you can hear me all right. Here we go. So we have 4 motives of action. We can be motivated by weal or happiness, and we can be motivated by woe or suffering. Now, for both of these, we can want them for ourselves, be motivated on behalf of ourselves, or we can want them for another, be motivated on behalf of another person or animal, right? So 4 quadrants, 4 motives. So the weal or happiness of ourself. Let's start with this one. This motive is pretty common. So if you remember our doctrine on the will, I know I've said that a bunch of times. If you remember Schopenhauer's doctrine on the will, there it is again. We all have this will which manifests within us, and it manifests within us as a sort of constant pursuit of desire. We get all these cravings, all these desires within us, and we're sort of restlessly left to pursue them, right? So we have desires for food, we have desires for water, we have desires for sex, we have desires for status, we have just endless desires. And we pursue them because we think that they're going to bring us happiness. So we pursue our desires because we think that they're going to bring us happiness. And this is, of course, all related to ourselves. So what is this? This is plain old egoism, as you can see, also called selfishness. Now, we're going to get to the moral component of this in next episode, but as a preview, this is just our default stance in the world. It's human nature, it's animal nature to be egoistic as a default stance. We're egoistic most of the time. Some of us never transcend egoism. Some of us are just egoistic. There's nothing else within us. We're just on that rat wheel, chasing our desires, acting egoistically, not really caring about the suffering or well-being of other people. So this is our default state. This is egoism. Now, if we go down 1 quadrant to this bottom left quadrant, I think that's how it appears, we have the weal or happiness of another. So what would that look like? What would it look like if I see somebody else and I just want them to be happier? I want them to not be suffering so much. Well, that's obviously what we were talking about at the beginning of the video. That is just compassion. So compassion is great. Compassion allows us to transcend our egoism and care about the well-being and suffering of other people for the sake of that other person. This is great. Now again, we're not getting into the morality of all of these motives right now. We're just outlining them, but there's a lot more to come on this guy right here. Now we're going to move over one to the right of compassion, which is acting motivated by the suffering of another. Now, not just acting motivated by their suffering, but wanting their suffering, desiring their woe. Right? This would be something like knowing that another person is hungry, having the ability to give them food, but voluntarily denying them food because you want them to suffer, you want them to have pain. Now, Schopenhauer thinks this is actually pretty common. Now, it doesn't always take the form of, profound evil, but it's pretty common. Now, if you've ever heard of the term Schadenfreude, this is a German term. It means taking delight in the suffering or pain of another. Now, think about fail compilations. Think about laughing when other people hurt themselves. Think about pranks. These are all things which aim towards the suffering of another. They're motivated towards the suffering of another, and we take delight in them. We actually enjoy the suffering of others. So Schadenfreude is going to be one example of wanting the suffering of another. But this is also going to go all the way up to moral evils, which, I keep saying we're not going to get into the morality of things. We're not, but as a preview of what's to come, this is going to get into moral evils. So what is this? It can be cruelty, it can be Schadenfreude, but The term it's described by is malice. Schopenhauer calls acting motivated by the suffering of another, wanting to induce their suffering, wanting to induce their woe. He calls this malice. So we have 3 of our 4 covered. Now there's one more. I have 2 labels right here, which is wanting the suffering of oneself. Now, off bat, you might think that this is a little bit bizarre. You might think, why would anyone want their own suffering? Why would I be motivated to act to make myself suffering? And this is a good point. You know, in one of his works, the work where he really outlines these most clearly, he doesn't even include this because he doesn't think that it's going to make sense to his readers. But elsewhere, such as in the World is Will and Representation, he talks about this indirectly, and there are some places where he also talks about it directly. He writes in a letter at one point talking about inducing the suffering of oneself, and he talks about it having what he calls ascetic value, which is basically value in self-discipline, self-denial. So he never names this motive explicitly, so here we have unnamed motive, right? Because it's an unnamed motive, but what it is and what he talks about indirectly is this is really just asceticism. So this is going to be less common than the other motives, but if you think about everyday things, like people are obsessed with ice baths right now, right? Now that's just wanting to invoke suffering in oneself. Now there may be some benefit to it hedonically, but really at its core, it's wanting to suffer. Now people do fasting. Some people do fasting because they want to lose weight. Some people do fasting because they think it's good to learn to deny their desires, right? People practice all sorts of voluntary restraint from desire. And all of that would be probably, unless it has some deeper motive in egoism, all that like stoic self-denial, you know, anything, what's the word? Yeah, so all of this popular stoic stuff where, you know, you voluntarily put yourself through pain and hardship in order to build self-discipline, build self-character. For the most part, that's all going to be this unnamed motive, which I'm calling asceticism. So here we have the 4 motives. I realize now that it's not quite as pretty as I originally hoped for, but that's okay. We have egoism, we have compassion, we have malice, and we have asceticism. So this is, for Schopenhauer, an exhaustive list of human motives. Animals have egoism. I think animals just have egoism for Schopenhauer. Yeah, animals just have egoism. Humans Animals have egoism and compassion, right? We talked about that earlier. But humans have also asceticism, and they also have malice. We can be motivated to induce suffering, whereas animals cannot. So this is very interesting for Schopenhauer. And he thinks that this is an exhaustive list of motives of action. And what does that mean? That means bad news if you're a Kantian, I guess. That means you can't be motivated by something like duty or respect for reason and the rational law of things. That would have to be reducible to one of these, or it would in fact not be a motive of action. So this is all that there is for Schopenhauer. Yeah, so let me know in the comments section if you think Schopenhauer is missing anything in this list, and let me know why. As I mentioned, Kant's morality involves being motivated by what he calls duty, which for Kant doesn't actually fit into any of these. He never declares that we can in fact be motivated by duty. So whether that is or isn't the case, whether we can be motivated by duty or not, whether it would fit into one of these, it's interesting. I might make a video on it in the future. Let me know in the comment section if that's something you would want. Let me know if you have any thoughts on it. Yeah, I'm curious to hear what everyone thinks. But this is it, right? So this is it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe. Put any questions that you have in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond as quickly as I can. Next episode is going to be good. So I'm actually writing a philosophy thesis. It's like an undergraduate dissertation next year on Schopenhauer's moral theory. So that's why I'm so excited about this right now. And next episode, we're going to connect this picture of things to the moral claims that he makes. We're going to get more detailed into all of these motives. We're going to connect it to his morality. We're going to explain some really unique claims that Schopenhauer makes. And overall, you know, I think it's just going to be great. I really hope I see you for that episode. That'll be part 8. Wow. So yeah, I hope to see you there. Please leave a comment. Please subscribe. You know the deal. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.